Story 1. The Creepy Farmhouse. When I was 14, my family moved into a big rundown farmhouse. It was old, a little eerie, but affordable to rent. Our nearest neighbors were far away, and the property was surrounded by a sprawling cornfield. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up because the hallway light was on. I'm a light sleeper, so small disturbances tend to wake me. A few minutes later, my dog started whining and scratching at my bedroom door, wanting to come in. It was unusual for him to wake me like that, but I let him in, and he crawled under my bed to sleep, which he did sometimes. Still, the whole thing felt odd. Too tired to dwell on it, I went back to sleep. Not long after, I woke up again to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. In the dim light, I saw fingers wrapping around the edge of the door as it slowly pushed open. Half asleep, I called out, "Who is it?" A man's voice, poorly imitating a woman, answered, "It's your mother." Something about it didn't feel right. "No, you're not. You don't sound like my mom," I said, but he kept insisting. Groggy as I was, it didn't fully register how bizarre the situation was until I saw an arm start to push through the opening. Panic shot through me. I screamed, realizing someone was trying to enter my room. My dog, hearing the commotion, jumped out from under the bed and lunged at the door. The sudden attack startled the intruder, who quickly shut the door. I couldn't see much, just a vague silhouette retreating. My screams woke my mom, who rushed to my room. She told me she'd seen a large figure standing outside my door, wearing what looked like stockings over their head. She started screaming too, and the person bolted down the back staircase. This staircase was disguised as a closet, suggesting the intruder knew the house's layout. The person disappeared into the cornfield. Nothing was stolen, and it seemed like their only intent was to enter my room. To this day, the memory leaves me shaken, and I've never felt quite the same. Story 2. The Quick Mart Ghost. I work the graveyard shift at a Quick Mart where I'm the only employee on duty for 8 hours. After 5 months on the job, I've grown used to the usual sounds and quirks of the place. When I first started, a customer mentioned an old man who used to work there. They told me he'd passed away from a stroke about 2 years earlier. A few days later, during a shift change, the guy I was relieving asked if I had any questions about the store. I said I was pretty familiar with things by then, but he replied, "Let me show you something." He led me to the back room and pointed to an old jacket hanging there. "That belonged to the old man who worked here," he said. "Our manager liked him so much that he couldn't bring himself to throw it away." Sometimes, during the graveyard shift, you might hear strange noises. At first, I shrugged it off, but a few nights later, I started noticing odd things. The cooler door would open and close on its own, and cans would randomly fall off shelves. Most of it seemed explainable, air pressure or vibrations. But one night, something happened that really freaked me out. While I was browsing Reddit during a quiet moment, I heard a scuffling noise on the other side of the store. It lasted only a few seconds, but was loud enough to make my heart race. I couldn't find the source, and no one else was around. Working alone at night is eerie enough, but now I can't help but wonder if the old man's presence still lingers in the store. One night during my graveyard shift at Quick Mart, I noticed something odd. A packet of ramen sitting by the sugar, about 5 feet away from where it should have been. It was positioned at an angle, almost as if something had dragged it. Curious, I decided to investigate. I set my iPhone to record 30-minute clips, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, had moved the packet. After 2 sessions of recording, the packet hadn't budged. Frustrated, I picked it up, grabbed my phone, and returned to work. But just 5 minutes later, I heard that same scuffling noise again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. Paranoia crept in, and I started to wonder, what if it's the ghost everyone talks about? The next day, my manager came in and asked how my night went. I gave her a strange look and hesitantly asked, "Do you ever hear weird noises around here?" She laughed. "Oh, you mean Frank?" My stomach dropped. "Wait, Frank? You mean the old man who died here?" Still laughing, she shook her head. "No, I mean Frank the mouse. He's been eating all the ramen packets. Turns out, a mouse in a gas station nearly convinced me ghosts were real. Story 3. The Scraggly Stranger. When I was a teenager, my older brother had already moved out, and my parents often worked late. I'd spend many evenings alone in our countryside home, a few miles out of town with only a handful of neighbors nearby. One day after school, I settled in for a quiet evening, watching TV, snacking, and texting a friend I had a crush on. That's when I noticed a man outside. He walked past the house a few times, looking scraggly and unkempt. I tried to stay out of sight, crouching behind a chair while keeping an eye on him through the window. Eventually, he came to the front door and knocked. Nervously, I texted my friend, my anxiety growing as the man continued to knock. My phone was ready to call 911, but I decided to carefully unlock the door and open it just a crack. Only the screen door separated us, and I kept my hand on it, ready to slam it shut. The man looked wild, his eyes darted around, and he was sweating heavily. He had a thick beard, seemed in his late 50s or early 60s, and was much larger than me. "Please, call the police," he said breathlessly. "They're after me." "Who's after you?" I asked, my heart racing. I barely escaped. "They were right behind me. Please, can I come inside?" Every instinct screamed not to let him in. "Just wait here," I said. "I'll get help." I shut and locked the door, then sprinted to lock the back door as well. My hands were shaking as I called 911. The operator assured me someone was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. The man paced nervously in the driveway, glancing down the road each time a car passed. Finally, a patrol car pulled up. The officer spoke to the man for a few minutes before they both got into the car and drove away. I never found out if he was truly in danger or just unstable, but the fear in his eyes was haunting. It made me realize just how unpredictable and dangerous the world can be. I went back to my room, still clutching my glass of water, unsure of what would happen next. I don't know what became of those two men who showed up at our house in the middle of the night, but I hope I never see them again. This incident reminded me of something that happened years ago at our old house, before we moved here. My dad was watching us while my mom went to a concert. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of loud voices. There was a stranger sitting on our couch, and my family was talking to him. I noticed the man had blood on his face, and in my groggy state, I thought I was dreaming. It wasn't until years later, as a teenager, that I mentioned it to my mom and learned the full story. She explained that my dad had forgotten to lock the back door. A drunk man, fresh out of a taxi, wandered into our house, thinking it was his girlfriend's place in another suburb. He had been in a fight, which explained the blood. Thankfully, when he realized his mistake, he left peacefully, but the thought of it still unsettled me. At the time, my mom and I lived in a cheap, rundown trailer in a rough trailer park. It was just the two of us after my dad left. My mom worked 2 jobs and attended cosmetology school to make ends meet. She was always exhausted, and I often spent the night at my aunt's house because my mom worked graveyard shifts. One morning, my mom picked me up from my aunt's place around 7 a.m. We drove back to our trailer, but I remember begging her not to go inside. I wanted to ride my bike instead, but my mom, completely drained, just wanted to sleep. Reluctantly, we went inside. She collapsed onto her bed, and I settled in to watch Barney, like any typical toddler. Eventually, I got bored and woke her up to ask if I could go outside and ride my bike. We kept my bike in my room because if we left it outside, it would get stolen. That morning, I told my mom I didn't want to play in my room and asked if I could lie down with her instead. As we were lying there, I suddenly said, "There's someone in the closet, and he wants to hurt me." I don't know why I felt that way. I hadn't even gone into my room that day. My mom, trying to reassure me, got up to check the closet and show me there was nothing to worry about. But when she tried to open the folding door, it got stuck. Something was blocking it. When she finally forced the door open, she discovered that a previously convicted child molester who had skipped bail had been hiding in there. He had been watching my mom's routine for days, waiting for an opportunity. He broke into our house while my mom was at work and hid in the closet, taking my bike with him to lure me into the room. Thankfully, the bike had gotten stuck on the metal tabs at the bottom of the folding door, preventing him from attacking my mom when she opened it. We ran out of the house as fast as we could, got into the car, and drove away. Unfortunately, the man escaped before the police arrived. To this day, closets terrify me because of that incident, even 26 years later. Another unsettling experience happened during college. I sublet a place from a friend over the summer and shared it with a group of college buddies. It was great, but I worked late afternoon shifts, so I usually got home around 2 p.m. One afternoon, I was watching TV when I started hearing banging noises. I assumed it was one of my housemates coming home at an odd time and maybe struggling with a door. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the banging grew louder and more persistent. Eventually, I realized something wasn't right. I got up to check and discovered someone actively breaking into the house through the back door. Panic set in, but I stayed calm enough to act quickly. I put on my shoes, grabbed my phone, and called the police with my earbuds so I could keep my hands free. I positioned myself near another exit in case I needed to run. The intruder finally forced his way in and saw me. I was already talking to the 911 dispatcher and bolted out the other exit as fast as I could. The police arrived shortly after. I provided a description of the man and watched as their sirens filled the air. The landlord temporarily secured the back door by nailing it shut until the frame could be repaired and a new deadbolt installed. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the experience left me shaken. I work in an office and used to do the overnight shift from midnight to 8 a.m. During my lunch breaks, I'd often take a nap. I work on the 14th floor, but at night, there's hardly anyone around. So I'd head down to the vacant second floor to sleep. It was always quiet there apart from the occasional street noise. The second floor had its drawbacks, though. They turned off the heat during winter, so it would get cold, but I'd use my coat as a blanket, which made it just warm enough to nap. The lights on that floor were motion activated, but oddly, they were wired backward. They'd stay on until you walked into the area, and then they'd shut off. I had a favorite spot in the conference room waiting area. 2 chairs pushed together made the perfect little bed, and there was a pillar I could sleep behind, hidden from view. Once the lights shut off, I'd close my eyes, and by the time they turned back on, I'd usually be fast asleep. One night, around 3:30 a.m., I set up my chairs and drifted off quickly. But then I heard something strange. Footsteps echoing down the hallway, accompanied by the distinct jingle of keys. At first, I thought it was just the janitor, so I stayed still, thinking he'd see my employee badge and move on. But as the footsteps got closer, something fell off. They reached the corner near where I was sleeping and then stopped. I expected him to walk past, but instead, it sounded like he was marching in place. The keys jingled rhythmically, but the sound didn't move. It stayed at the same distance, just around the corner. I didn't want to lift my head. Technically, I wasn't supposed to be napping there, and I didn't want to risk getting in trouble. But after a few minutes of the sound staying in the same spot, my curiosity got the better of me. Was this person trying to wake me up, or just messing with me? I decided to lift my head and take a look, but I couldn't move. I tried to roll over, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't move my arms, legs, or even speak. I could barely open my eyes, just enough to see the faint light still on. That's when the light shut off. The footsteps, which had been marching in place, started moving again, this time coming in my direction. The keys jingled louder as they approached. I tried to sit up, to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. Then I felt it, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. 2 large hands, firm and unrelenting, pinned me down. It was as if someone was holding me with all their strength. I couldn't see them. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't even scream. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably just a minute or so. Finally, the weight lifted. My eyes opened, and the room was empty. There was no one on top of me, no one around. The footsteps and jingling keys retreated, fading back around the corner and into the distance. I sat up, and to my horror, the chairs were no longer where I had pushed them. I always arranged them behind the pillar to stay hidden from anyone passing by. But now I was lying in the middle of the hallway. The chairs had been pushed away from the pillar and closer to the window. The light was still off, which meant something had moved recently to trigger the motion sensor. I began hearing a low humming in my ears, like an electric buzz, and realized I was drenched in sweat. Panicked, I grabbed my jacket to wipe my face, and when I pulled it away, I was back in my original spot. The chairs were where I'd left them. The buzzing sound was just the overhead lights flickering back on. There were no footsteps, no jingling keys, nothing. I quickly gathered my things and rushed back upstairs, my heart pounding. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I've experienced sleep paralysis before as a side effect of medication. I chalked it up to that, a nightmare mixed with paralysis, but it felt so real. It was terrifying. Later, I mentioned the incident to a coworker. He listened and then said, "You know, there's a story about one of the workers who helped build this office. Supposedly, he killed himself during construction. Some people say they've seen his ghost wandering around empty rooms or walking the halls." We laughed it off. "Yeah, right," I said, trying to dismiss it. He added, "They even say he carried keys, jingling as he walked. Classic ghost story stuff." I shrugged it off, convinced it was just an overactive imagination paired with sleep paralysis. But part of me couldn't shake how vivid it had felt. Story 5. This next story takes place in a Southeast Asian city with a population of over 1.5 million. I didn't always live there. I was born and raised in a small Midwestern town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and the only time it gains attention is during election years. In 2014, my parents and I moved to this bustling city. There were several reasons for the move, but the biggest was my mom's desire to be closer to her family. This was her homeland. The town where most of my relatives live is about 8 hours away. We chose to settle in this city because it's considered the safest in the region for foreigners, and my dad is, quite obviously, a white man. Unlike most college students, I hadn't done much that summer. The intense heat kept me inside most days, and I didn't have much money to spend even if I wanted to brave the outdoors. The only thing that occasionally tempted me to leave the apartment was the constant noise of construction, the banging and clanging from a new building being added next door. Still, leaving the apartment was inevitable. Toward the end of the month, my parents and I went grocery shopping. The next day, my mom and I ventured out again to pick up a few items we'd forgotten. Then, the day after that, we went out yet again to pay some bills. It was the first time in weeks that I'd gone out 3 days in a row. By 7 p.m., on the third night, I had fallen asleep on the living room couch. Around 10 p.m., my mom woke me up and told me to go to my room. Too tired to go through my full nighttime routine, I simply brushed my teeth and headed upstairs. When I got to my room, I noticed my cat was already curled up on my bed. This was unusual since he was typically glued to my mom's side. Trying not to disturb him, cat owners will understand the gymnastics required to avoid waking a sleeping cat. I carefully got into bed. I turned on a dim light, plugged in my phone, and played a random YouTube video. Before long, I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to my bed shaking. At first, I thought nothing of it. My cat often scratches his ears while sleeping beside me, and his movements can jostle the bed. However, since there had been a strong earthquake the night before, I wondered if it could be another tremor. I opened my eyes slightly to check. It wasn't an earthquake. It was my cat scratching, just as I'd suspected. Then I noticed someone standing at the foot of my bed. My groggy mind registered it as my mom. She was probably checking on me before her usual 5 a.m. walk with my dad. It looked like she was bending down to pet the cat. I was about to fall back asleep when something felt off. I opened my eyes a little wider to get a better look. That's when I noticed something strange. My mom was wearing one of my high school t-shirts. This was odd because we're completely different sizes, and she's never borrowed my clothes before. Then I realized she wasn't just wearing one shirt. She had another one of my high school t-shirts wrapped around her head in a peculiar way, framing her face. It didn't cover anything, just outlined her features in an unsettling manner. As I processed this, something else caught my attention. My closet doors were wide open. My mom always insisted I keep them closed to prevent the air conditioning from cooling the closet unnecessarily, so I usually complied. I hadn't been using the closet, so there was no reason for the doors to be open. I also noticed her posture. While my mom occasionally pets the cat when checking on me, I couldn't recall her ever bending down in the way this person was, especially not in recent years. All these thoughts hit me within seconds, but my groggy brain was still fixated on why my mom would be wearing my clothes. I sat up slightly, squinting to read the writing on the back of the shirt to confirm if it was mine or just similar. That's when the person turned to face me. My half-asleep confusion turned to terror as the figure bolted out of my room, crouching in a way that seemed disturbingly unnatural. It wasn't until they reached the stairs that my mind fully registered what was happening. This wasn't my mom. It wasn't even a woman. I shot out of bed, instinctively wrapping my blanket around myself as my nightclothes suddenly felt too revealing. My heart pounded as I realized the horrifying truth. This was an intruder, not a family member. The way the intruder moved, so fast, bent over, and crouched in that bizarre, unnatural way, still haunts me. It was only then that I began screaming. Hesitantly, I followed him out of my room and watched as he bolted down the wooden stairs. Each step echoed loudly through the third floor, almost drowning out my cries. If I was going to get my parents' attention, who were asleep behind a closed door on the second floor, I needed to be louder. I planted myself at the top of the stairs and screamed as loudly as I could, my lungs straining with the effort. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds, my parents' bedroom door flew open. My mom rushed up the stairs with a panicked expression, grabbing me by the shoulders. "What is it? What's wrong?" she shouted. I turned to her, overwhelmed with confusion and disbelief. How had she not seen the man who had just run past their door? Everything had happened so quickly that I couldn't be sure if they crossed paths. "There's someone in the house," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with fear. Without hesitation, my mom wrapped an arm around me and began urging me down the stairs, shouting in our native tongue, "Grab a gun." We rushed into my parents' bedroom, where my dad was standing groggily in the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and alarm. I pushed him inside, turned, and shut the door behind us, fumbling for the light switch. My dad eventually flipped the lights on, illuminating the room. I stared at him in disbelief, realizing he had been standing in the doorway, with a clear view of the intruder running away. Yet he seemed completely unaware. "There's someone in the house," I repeated more forcefully this time. My dad's expression shifted as the gravity of my words sunk in. He kept his gaze on the floor, processing the situation and trying to decide what to do. My mom, however, reacted instantly. She grabbed her phone, frantically dialing 911 while pulling at her hair in nervous bursts. But moments later, she looked up and said, "The call won't go through." I took the phone from her and tried dialing myself. When I pressed it to my ear, I was met with a monotone voice. "Sorry, your balance is too low to make this call." In this country, most phones were prepaid, meaning if your account didn't have enough credit, you couldn't make calls or send texts. My mom swore she had just topped up her balance earlier that day. Desperate, I tried calling my aunt, who lived 8 hours away. The call went through immediately. That's when we realized the problem. Cell phones could only connect with other cell phones, while landlines could only connect with other landlines, including emergency services like 911. The issue was that our landline was in the second floor hallway, just a few feet away from the other side of the door. I explained this to my parents, and my mom immediately opened the bedroom window, shouting for help in her native tongue. Reacting instinctively, I shut the window. "Don't do that. They'll know we're defenseless, and they'll come back, or worse, come in," I whispered sharply as I shut the window. By now, we had been locked in the bedroom for about 40 minutes. Fear clawed at my thoughts. What if the intruder had left, but heard my mom's shouting and decided to return? The idea made me feel like we were sitting ducks. "Are you sure you saw someone?" "Maybe you were dreaming," my dad finally said. It was the first time he had spoken since we barricaded ourselves inside. His question made me bristle. How could someone have gotten in? "The door has 2 locks and a heavy pole across it," he added. After the lock on our screen door had broken, my mom insisted on placing a sturdy metal pole across it as an extra barrier. It seemed impossible for anyone to bypass it. "I know what I saw," I said firmly. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt began to creep in. Could it have all been in my head? The figure, the sounds, the frantic movement, they had all felt so vivid. Yet my parents hadn't seen anyone when the figure ran past their door. What if I had imagined the whole thing? The thought unsettled me, but outwardly I clung to my certainty. "We need to get out of this room and call the police," my dad said, breaking the silence. My overthinking kicked in. What if there were more intruders? What if they were waiting just outside the door, ready to ambush us? Or worse, hiding elsewhere in the apartment, rummaging through our belongings because they knew we were too scared to leave? What if my mom's shouting had drawn them back? Desperation pushed us to search the room for anything we could use as a weapon. But the results were grim. You might be wondering about the gun my mom had shouted about earlier. There wasn't one. She had only said that to scare the intruder, hoping it would make him leave. So there we were, my dad holding half a pair of broken scissors and my mom clutching a small floor lamp. We braced ourselves for whatever might be waiting on the other side of the door. With a swift motion, my dad unlocked the door and swung it open, hoping to catch anyone outside by surprise. The hallway greeted us with an eerie yellow glow, its silence thick and oppressive, like a scene from a horror movie. Straight ahead, the door to the second-floor balcony stood wide open, and the screen on the nearby window had been pried loose. My first emotion was relief. It meant I wasn't imagining things. The second feeling that washed over me was dread. It confirmed that someone had really broken in. We searched the second floor, but found nothing unusual and no one in sight. Then we moved to the first floor. That's when we saw it. A pitcher of water sitting on the kitchen table, dripping with condensation. "Did you forget to put it back before bed?" my mom asked. I shook my head firmly. I remembered only brushing my teeth before going to sleep. I hadn't taken out the pitcher. Our windows have a unique design, glass on the outside and screens on the inside, unlike typical American windows. We saw that the glass was still shut, but the screen had been pried open. Both locks on the doors were still bolted, and the metal pole was still securely in place. So how did they get in? We guessed that the intruder had first tried to break in through the screen window, prying it open to unlock the door. But his reach wasn't long enough. Frustrated, he likely climbed up to the second floor, repeated the process, and managed to unlock the door there. This was possible because construction workers hadn't finished sealing off certain areas of the building, giving him access to climb through an unfinished apartment. We tried calling 911 5 times. Despite the police station being just a 3-minute drive away, it took them no less than 45 minutes to arrive. While we waited, my mom went door to door trying to warn our neighbors. No one answered. When the police finally showed up, they mentioned receiving a call earlier about a woman screaming for help, likely my mom. But they couldn't locate where the screams had come from. They searched our apartment and found no one. They didn't even offer guidance on how to file a proper report. Their visit felt useless. We informed our landlord about the break-in, but she claimed there had never been any incidents before. However, when we spoke to a neighbor, she revealed that there had been 3 break-ins recently. Over the next few weeks, we started noticing missing items, sunglasses, backpacks, jewelry, money, and various belongings from our storage room. My phone was gone. I realized he must have taken it when he crouched over my bed. Strangely, my laptop and camera, which were sitting right next to my jewelry box, were left untouched. My parents believed the intruder had planned to grab the heavier items last, so he wouldn't have to carry them around immediately. But this didn't fully make sense to me. I hadn't seen him carrying anything when he fled. Oddly, he took 4 of my shirts, 2 of them were identical, and went into my cousin's room to steal her towel. Thankfully, she had gone home for the summer and wasn't there. The most unsettling detail? He drank straight from our water pitcher, likely while still inside the apartment. This made sense since he had climbed all the way to the 2nd floor. It must have been exhausting. In this country, superstition runs deep. My mom later told me about an eerie belief. Thieves sometimes leave water behind to cast a spell, making homeowners fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. It was a creepy and unsettling experience that made all of us far more cautious about security. But one question still lingers in my mind. How did the intruder seem to know exactly which rooms to target? He went into mine and my cousin's, yet completely avoided my parents' room. There's a belief that water symbolizes the calming waves of the ocean. I've never been one to believe in superstitions, but my mom thinks that's why I was able to wake up that night. A few hours after the incident, we decided it was time to move back to the States. This wasn't the sole reason for our decision, but it was definitely the final straw. I'm just grateful that we all came out safe and unharmed, and I'll forever be thankful to my cat. He's the real hero for waking me up. My cousins are already arguing over who gets to keep him once we leave. Story 6. I was about 19 and still in college at the time. Studying at home had always been a challenge for me, so I would often head out to coffee shops in the evenings or late at night to study. Around that time, I developed a habit of going to the McDonald's near my house. I'd grab a burger and settle into one of the booths to focus on my work. It was closer and more convenient than driving into the city. One evening, I was sitting in the booth closest to the bathrooms when an older man, probably in his 70s, walked by. As he passed, he stopped to compliment my hair. Chestnut-colored hair, just like my mother's. She was beautiful, he said. I thanked him politely and turned back to my notes, hoping the interaction would end there. But he didn't move. Instead, he lingered for a moment, then sat down at my table, completely uninvited. He started talking about his daughter, mentioning that she was likely around my age. He shared how much he loved visiting her and playing music for her. I want to show you a video of her, he said, pulling out his phone. I wasn't thrilled about him sitting at my table, but he seemed harmless. Maybe he was just lonely and looking for someone to talk to, so I decided to humor him. When he showed me the video, I was completely unprepared for what I saw. The shaky footage showed a young woman in her 20s lying in a hospital bed, seemingly in a vegetative state, her mouth hanging open. In the background, I could hear what I assumed was his voice, talking and singing to her. She's in a coma, he revealed. I was taken aback. I don't even remember exactly what I said. Something about how sorry I was for his situation. The emotional weight of his story caught me off guard, and the whole interaction felt surreal. I tried to redirect my attention, subtly picking up my phone to call my boyfriend, who was supposed to meet me there after his shift. By now it was around 11 p.m., and the man was still at my table, sharing deeply personal details about his life. I was clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Finally, he got up and left. I watched as he walked out the front doors and headed to a large white van parked nearby. When he opened the side door, I caught a glimpse of the interior. Clothes, bedding, and boxes crammed together in a chaotic mess. It seemed like he might be living in the van. He crawled inside, and I thought that was the end of our encounter. Relieved, I went back to studying for my math test. A little while later, the front doors opened again. To my disbelief, he walked straight back to my table. This time he handed me a business card. "I'm running for president," he said with a smile. "I'd appreciate your vote." The card had nothing but his name and a cheesy slogan printed on it. After that, the man went back to his van and drove off. Needless to say, after that encounter, and a few other strange run-ins with homeless people, I stopped studying at McDonald's. To the presidential candidate living in his van, let's not meet again. In my late teens, while living in Dublin, Ireland, I frequented a particular nightclub every week and got to know many of the regulars. One evening, I was introduced to a new woman whom no one really seemed to know. We exchanged polite hellos and had a brief conversation before I went back to my usual night of dancing and drinking. At the end of the night, I decided to leave a bit earlier than my friends since I lived far outside the city. I took a taxi home, went straight to bed, and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming into my room, but something fell off. The bed was heavier than usual. Groggy and confused, I looked down and there she was. The woman from the nightclub was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at me with wide eyes and a strange, unsettling smile. Her expression wasn't lustful. It was something much creepier, almost obsessive. A chill ran down my spine. Summoning every ounce of courage, I got up, got dressed, and told her firmly, "You're leaving now." I marched her out of the house and told her that buses left from the end of the road every half hour. She didn't say a word, just left quietly. Later, after talking to friends and family, I pieced together what had happened. After I left the nightclub, she tried to follow me but lost track of where I went. Instead of giving up, she went back to the club and asked around until someone mentioned the general area where I lived. She then took a taxi there and began knocking on random doors, waking up my neighbors. Eventually, someone pointed her to my exact address. She even managed to convince my sister, who was annoyed about being woken up, that I had been expecting her. My sister let her in, and from there, she found her way into my room. To this day, I don't know how long she sat there, just watching me sleep. What unsettles me the most is realizing how easily she gained access to my home, to my bedroom. If she had wanted to hurt me, she could have done so with ease. The thought of her sitting there for hours still makes my skin crawl. Switching topics, here's another story from when I was about 6 years old. I'm 19 now, working full-time, and I've moved out of the place where this happened. At the time, we lived in a decent neighborhood, though there were occasional sketchy people passing through. Some nearby apartment buildings had residents involved in drugs, but they generally kept to themselves and didn't bother anyone. Our house was a good size, and my dad had built a large garage big enough to hold 3 vehicles. The rafters were used for storing seasonal items like Halloween and Christmas decorations. This happened in December in Atlantic Canada, a region known for its brutal snowstorms and blizzards. That day, I was outside playing in the snow while my dad worked on a project in the garage. At one point, he got thirsty and went inside the house to grab a drink. When he came back out, he noticed footprints in the snow leading into the garage. "Did you go into the garage?" he asked me. I shook my head. "No." We both brushed it off and went about our evening. Later that night, after my dad and I had gone to bed, my mom came home from her late shift. She noticed some of my toys, stored up in the garage rafters, had been moved and were now scattered on the floor. She thought nothing of it, tidied up, parked her car in the garage, and went inside to watch TV before heading to bed. The next morning, my dad woke up around 4 a.m. to get ready for work. When he stepped into the garage, he found the garage door wide open. He was furious and immediately woke everyone up. After checking the garage, he came back inside, visibly freaked out. When we realized a lot of our expensive equipment was missing, we called the police. Turning on the outside lights, we saw the same mysterious footprints leading from the garage into the backyard and into the forest behind our house. The police arrived and began their investigation. My mom mentioned the toys that had fallen from the rafters the night before, so the officers borrowed a ladder to check the area. What they found was deeply unsettling. A gun, a meat cleaver, 3 condoms, 2 of which were used, and other suspicious items. I couldn't sleep for a week after that. The thought of someone lurking in our garage, prepared for violence, terrified me. 2 weeks later, they caught the guy trying to sell my dad's stolen equipment at a pawn shop. He confessed to everything, admitting that he had been watching our house for an entire month to learn our routines. He had broken into several other houses on our street as well. He brought the weapons, just in case, and he confessed that he had planned to use the condoms when he saw my mom. Thankfully, nothing worse happened. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but I still shudder to think about what could have occurred if we had encountered him that night. This next story is one my dad told me. It happened in the summer of 1993 when he and his girlfriend, now my stepmother, were living in Cardiff, Wales. They lived in a relatively quiet area in the city centre, known for its student accommodations. Around 6 a.m., my dad got up to make his morning coffee. Walking into the kitchen, he was shocked to see a random man sitting at the table, silently staring at him. Instead of panicking, my dad calmly asked, "Want a cup of coffee?" The man nodded, and they sat down together. A few minutes later, my dad's girlfriend came into the kitchen. Remarkably, she didn't freak out either. Instead, she offered to make the man some breakfast. The 3 of them ate together, chatting for about 20 minutes. My dad later said the conversation was strange and nonsensical, but they didn't discuss the details. After breakfast, they politely escorted the man to the front door. As soon as he was gone, they locked the door and started panicking. They called the police, who took their statements. Later that day, the police contacted my dad to say they had apprehended the intruder. He turned out to be a paranoid schizophrenic who had been breaking into odd-numbered houses on their street. My dad's house was the second he had entered. In the first house, which was empty, he had left his tools, a sawed-off shotgun and ammunition. His plan, as he later confessed, was to shoot anyone in the odd-numbered houses on the street. When the police asked why he didn't harm my dad or his girlfriend, the man said they were the nicest couple I've ever met. Their kindness and calm demeanor had apparently stopped him from carrying out his horrific plan. To this day, when people tell my dad he's too laid back for his own good, he shares this story, and it always leaves them speechless. A few months ago, my brother moved in with me and got a job doing night shift custodial work at a nearby high school. His shift started at 10 p.m., and since the school was close enough, he would walk there. The only downside was that his shift ended about 20 minutes after I had to leave for work, and he didn't have a car. One night just after midnight, he called me in a panic, asking me to come pick him up because weird stuff is happening. Those were his exact words, and he said there was no way he was staying there alone. My brother isn't the type to get scared over nothing, so I threw on some pajamas, grabbed my keys, and headed down to the high school. For some background, my brother has always seemed sensitive to the supernatural. When we were kids, he had several strange encounters. In one old house we lived in, he used to tell our parents that a man would come into his room at night and tell him bedtime stories. It wasn't until years later, when we were adults, that our dad told us a distant relative had committed suicide in that same room long before we were born. Strangely enough, my brother's description of the man matched the deceased relative perfectly. I'm the exact opposite. Nothing supernatural ever happens to me or around me. If a place has a history of creepy activity, it usually stops the moment I arrive and doesn't return after I leave. Friends and family have joked that I'm like a walking ghost repellent. Some have even told me that their homes felt normal or less creepy after I visited. When I got to the high school, my brother was waiting by the front doors, looking frazzled. He ran over to my car and begged me to come inside to make it stop. Apparently, he kept hearing the sound of lockers opening and slamming shut just out of sight. Every time he turned a corner, the noise would move behind him or to the next hallway over. We went into the school together, and my brother was practically clinging to my arm. It probably looked ridiculous. I'm short and round, and he's tall and lanky. a modern-day Laurel and Hardy. We walked up and down the hallways, but nothing happened. No strange noises, no movement, no lockers slamming, no cold spots or eerie feelings, just silence. As we reached the last hallway, it was close to 1 a.m. I was exhausted and ready to head home. There was one locker left ajar, and my brother hesitated. "You close it," he said, pulling his hand back. I sighed, closed the locker, and nothing happened. Finally, my brother said I could leave, but only if I promised to come back the next night if things got weird again. A week later, he came home and handed me a thank you note along with a $50 Amazon gift card from the head of the custodial department for services rendered. Easiest $50 I ever made. Story 7. This happened when I was 20, in the early 2000s, back when landlines were common and cell phone plans didn't include unlimited calls. It took place in a small town about an hour outside of Sacramento. A friend of mine was house sitting for a family her parents knew through church. The house was located in the countryside, just outside of town, surrounded by fields of cattle and corn. The family had several animals: cats, rabbits, a donkey, and a horse. They also had dogs, but they took them along on their trip, leaving my friend to take care of the rest of the animals and the house for the week. The family had a secure lockbox-style mailbox at the end of their long driveway, so she didn't need to collect the mail daily. With no neighbors for miles, it was clear the mailbox was more for peace of mind than necessity. Toward the end of her stay, my friend asked if I'd like to spend the night and keep her company. I thought it sounded like fun. I'd recently moved out of my aunt and uncle's place into my own apartment, so the idea of a quiet night in the country was appealing. After work, I picked her up and we drove to the house, stopping to grab dinner along the way. We arrived around 9:30 p.m. The first thing we did was head to the barn to feed the animals. It was late for their dinner, and they made their hunger known. After making sure they were fed and had enough water, we went into the house. The house was a large, single-story ranch-style home. The layout was straightforward. As you entered, the living room was to the left, while a long hallway to the right led to the bathroom and bedrooms. Straight ahead was a dining area, and to the left of that was the kitchen, which opened to a patio. It wasn't an open floor plan. Each area felt distinct. On the opposite side of the dining room, another long hallway stretched out, lined with several doors. My friend explained that the wife of the family ran a daycare business from home, and those rooms were play areas for the kids. She had been taking care of everything that week, and we didn't bother checking out the daycare rooms. There wasn't any reason to go in there. Instead, we settled into the main living area. We watched TV, ate leftovers, and chatted about people we knew. As it got late, my friend turned on the house alarm and mentioned she didn't like sleeping in other people's beds, so she'd been sleeping on the couch. She offered the couch to me and said she'd take one of the two huge recliners. The recliners were massive and could lean so far back they were practically flat. They were also incredibly comfortable, so I agreed to take one. I settled into a recliner with a blanket, and we turned off the TV. For about 20 minutes, we talked quietly in the dark until the motion sensors outside triggered the floodlights, flooding the room with bright light through the uncovered windows. I never understood why people in the country don't bother with curtains or blinds. It's unsettling. My friend, Amanda, froze, and then said, maybe it's one of the cats. But then we heard it, the crunch of gravel, like someone walking across the parking area outside. My chair was closest to the window, and my heart started racing. I carefully slid down onto the floor, clutching my blanket like a shield. The floodlights eventually timed out, and Amanda slid to the floor as well. We both lay flat on our stomachs in the dark, trying to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence, and the house alarm started blaring. The floodlights turned back on, illuminating everything. The alarm was deafening, and we instinctively covered our ears. Panic set in. I was so scared I thought I might pee myself. I started crawling toward the security keypad, hoping it had one of those emergency buttons, like I'd seen in commercials, the kind that automatically calls the police. When I reached it, the small screen displayed, patio 1 of 2 open. Amanda was quietly crying now, and she pressed the call assistance button on the keypad. Nothing happened, no response, no help. I asked where the nearest phone was. She said there was one in the kitchen and another in the parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. The choice wasn't easy. The kitchen was close to the windows and one of the patio doors, while the parents' room was further down the hall and pitch black. "Where's the second patio door?" I asked. Amanda whispered, "It's in the daycare part of the house." That made the decision for us. We headed for the parents' room, the farthest point from either patio. Inside, the darkness was absolute. "Where's the phone?" I whispered. Amanda hesitated. "I think it's on the nightstand, but we'll have to turn on the light to find it." The idea of flipping on a light terrified me, but we didn't have much choice, since we didn't have a flashlight, and I hadn't brought my cell phone because minutes were limited back then. We were in a bind. It was a simpler time. Amanda didn't even own a cell phone until after this night. She flipped on the bedroom light, and we began looking around. Not only did these people lack curtains on their windows, but they didn't even have a closet door. While scanning the room, we noticed a golf club leaning against the wall by the bed. It was likely their version of a baseball bat, like the one my family kept by our bed at home. We figured a golf club could still pack a punch, so Amanda grabbed it before we continued our search for the phone. We checked all the usual spots, finally finding the cordless phone stand. But the phone itself was missing. The alarm was still blaring, and with the lights now on, whoever had opened the patio door would definitely see us. "Should we use the locate phone button?" Amanda asked. "No," I said, horrified by the thought. What if the intruder has it? The last thing we need is for them to walk in asking if we're looking for something. I was furious and scared, standing there helpless. That's when the alarm abruptly stopped. The sudden silence felt more unnerving than the blaring noise. It was the kind of deep, eerie quiet you only get in the countryside. There wasn't another golf club for me to grab, so I told Amanda to go first. She reluctantly agreed, flipping every light on as we moved through the hallway, closing all the doors behind us. When we reached the security panel, it still displayed patio 1 of 2 open. We hit the call assistance button again, but it was useless. After confirming the front door was locked, we made our way to the kitchen. I told Amanda we had to check the patio near the kitchen. As we approached, I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the drawer. Unfortunately, it wasn't even sharp, but it was better than nothing. The kitchen patio door was locked. With all the lights on, we finally spotted the phone, a wired one attached to the wall. Amanda grabbed it and called 911, trying to explain everything to the dispatcher through her panicked tears. As she spoke, I heard a sharp whistle coming from the kitchen window. Here's the thing about turning on lights in a house at night. While it helps you see inside, it makes you completely visible to anyone outside. They, on the other hand, remain cloaked in darkness. The whistle was sharp and high-pitched, like someone trying to get someone's attention. It came from right outside the window. My heart was pounding, but I refused to press my face against the glass to see who or what was out there. Amanda was still on the phone, stammering and crying, saying she didn't know the house's exact address. Frustrated, she handed the phone to me. "Hello," I said, gripping the receiver tightly. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. The dispatcher, sounding annoyed, said she needed an address to send the police. I asked if she could trace the call, but her reply was sharp. "You're house sitting and don't even know where you are?" Frustrated and scared, I handed the phone back to Amanda and started frantically searching for something with an address in the kitchen. I rummaged through the junk drawer, scanned the counters, and checked the fridge, all while keeping an eye on the hallway that led to the daycare rooms, the same direction as the open patio door. Amanda, meanwhile, tried to explain to the dispatcher that she didn't check the mail because it was locked in a box at the end of the driveway. A few seconds later, Amanda froze, her expression going blank. I asked if the dispatcher was tracing the call, but Amanda just stared at me, pale-faced, and she said, "I hope the police find you in time," and then hung up. My stomach dropped. Fear and anger surged through me. We knew someone was outside. The patio door to the daycare area was open, and we didn't know what to do. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute, we stood frozen in the kitchen listening to the heavy silence. Finally, I picked up the phone and dialed 411, instructing Amanda to ask for the police department's number. Doing my best to stay calm, I explained the situation to the 411 operator, emphasizing the urgency of our need for police. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed from outside the kitchen window near the patio door. It sounded like someone had dropped something heavy and metal. Amanda started crying, and I couldn't hold it in anymore either. Tears streamed down my face as fear overwhelmed me. The 411 operator assured us they would connect us to the police and stay on the line until we were safe. When an officer finally answered, the 411 operator relayed the situation before transferring the call. As I spoke to the officer, the whistling sound came again, followed by a flood of light illuminating the house. My heart raced as I realized the police were arriving. The officer on the line told us to stay put and assured us that help was close. Moments later, he informed us that the police had reached the driveway. He instructed us to put down the phone and open the door for them. I cautiously approached the door and saw a police pickup truck with spotlights scanning the property. 2 officers walked beside the truck, shotguns in hand, as it moved slowly up the driveway. 4 officers approached the house, asking for our names before one of them picked up the phone to confirm their arrival. They told us to stay in the dining room while they searched the house and property. One by one, the officers returned, reporting that they hadn't found anyone. The last officer came in through the patio door near the kitchen and mentioned that the horses in the barn looked spooked. He asked if there were any other animals on the property, and Amanda told him about the rabbits. The officer also noted that the patio door to the daycare area wasn't locked, but a broom handle in the track had prevented it from opening too far. I glanced at the kitchen patio door and noticed it didn't have the same broom handle, which made me feel foolish, since that's how the officer had entered. After we gave our statements, the police told us they would patrol the area and that we could leave if we wanted. They locked the front door but couldn't reset the alarm. We didn't care, we just wanted to get out of there. We drove straight to Amanda's mom's house, completely shaken. Exhausted, we fell asleep, and I went to work the next morning. Later that day, Amanda called me, her voice trembling. She told me that when she went back to the house to feed the animals, she found footprints and animal droppings on the carpet. I tried to reassure her that it was probably from the police searching the barn, but she wasn't convinced. She also discovered something chilling in the barn. Someone had tied all 10 rabbits' legs together in their hutches. On top of that, there was a note that read "Lucky" scrawled on the back of a pizza coupon. Amanda recognized it as one that had been on the fridge, but all the other flyers and coupons were now missing. It took her and her sister a long time to untie the rabbits. Amanda's mom found someone else from the church to finish the house-sitting job. Amanda refused to go back. She reported the new findings to the police, but they never found anyone responsible or provided any updates. The experience left us both deeply unsettled, and Amanda was relieved to put that house and the ordeal behind her. When I was younger, I lived in a house with 4 roommates. It had a large backyard with a garage and a tool shed we never used, plus a motion detector light that would sometimes flick on unexpectedly. I assumed it was animals triggering it, but 2 of my roommates, who were superstitious and often used substances, were convinced it was ghosts. One night, one of them claimed she saw a ghostly man walking through the yard while she was high on mushrooms. They found the light terrifying. I just thought they were letting their imaginations get the better of them. A few nights later, after having a couple of drinks, I thought I saw a shadowy figure through the mesh door leading to the backyard. My mind immediately jumped to my roommates' ghost stories. and I dismissed it as a trick of the light or the alcohol. Eventually, I moved back to my home country, and 6 months later, during a FaceTime call with one of my old roommates, I found out the truth. It wasn't a ghost. A homeless man had been living in our tool shed the entire time. The thought of it gave me chills. Fast forward a few years, I had moved into a new apartment. The morning after my first night there, I was unpacking and expecting my roommate, who said she might stop by. Hearing someone at the front door, I assumed it was her, maybe struggling with some bags. But something made me pause. Instead of immediately opening the door, I looked through the peephole. To my shock, there was a man trying to break in. I froze, my hand on the deadbolt, holding it tightly as I waited for him to leave. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked away. Another incident happened during my senior year of college. I was living off campus in a townhouse with 2 roommates, Natalie and Katie. Katie was out that night, and around 3 a.m., I was woken by knocking on the front door. At first, I thought it was just someone who had the wrong house and would leave once they realized their mistake. But the knocking didn't stop. It went on for several minutes, growing louder and more insistent until it turned into full-on banging. Lying in bed, I felt increasingly uneasy. I probably should have called the police, but at the time, I was frozen with fear. It was the middle of the night, and I was groggy and confused. I got out of bed and headed to the top of the stairs, where I saw Natalie standing near the front door, staring at it. Her room was on the bottom floor, so she had been the first to approach. We exchanged a baffled look. After all, it was 3 a.m., and someone banging on the door was definitely unusual. Natalie called out, asking who they were and what they wanted. "We're Katie's friends," a male voice answered. They sounded about our age. We know her boyfriend and heard she was feeling down, so we came to surprise her. The story sounded odd, and thankfully, Katie wasn't even home. So we told them, "Katie's not here. She's out doing something else." We assumed they'd leave, considering the person they supposedly came to see wasn't there. Instead, one of them insisted, "Just open the door." Looking back, I know we should have called the police then and there. It was clearly strange, but in the moment it felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. You never think situations like this could happen to you. It's easy to rationalize, to believe everything will somehow work out fine. So instead of acting sensibly, Natalie and I made the mistake of engaging with them. We repeated that Katie wasn't there and told them there was no reason for them to stay. Natalie asked for their names, and while we'd been hearing 2 distinct voices, only one of them offered a name. I quickly texted Katie to ask if she knew anyone by that name. As we waited for her reply, the strangers at the door kept arguing with us, urging us to open the door. When Katie finally responded, she said she did know the person, but she was certain they didn't know where she lived. That set off alarms in my mind. I told Katie to stay where she was and not come back until we had everything sorted out. Meanwhile, the men outside kept insisting we open the door. Natalie and I warned them that if they didn't leave, we'd call the police. At that point, one of them said, No, don't call the police. If we wanted to do something bad, we would have done it already, right? That didn't ease our nerves. It only made things worse. The more they insisted, the more uncomfortable we felt. Finally, when it became clear they weren't leaving and the situation wasn't going to de-escalate, we grabbed the phone and called the cops. We retreated to Natalie's room and called 911 to report what was happening. Luckily, there was a police station nearby, so help wasn't far off. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of going back into the living room and shouting through the door that we'd called the cops. To our surprise, this didn't scare them much. They seemed only mildly annoyed and continued trying to argue their way inside. The situation took a sudden turn when we heard a neighbor's door swing open. An angry man yelled from across the street, threatening to call the police himself. For some reason, that seemed to rattle them. Without another word, they left, getting into a car parked out front and driving off. When the police arrived, we explained everything. Natalie mentioned that she had peeked through the blinds a few times during the ordeal and noticed something unnerving. There were actually two men. Only one was ever at the door at any given time, while the other waited in the driver's seat of the car, seemingly ready for a quick getaway. Natalie also observed that they didn't appear drunk, and their speech was clear, which made the situation even more unsettling. Unfortunately, there wasn't much the police could do. They swept the area and advised us to call immediately if the men returned instead of engaging with them. One of the officers gave us some self-defense tips, suggesting household items or chemicals we could use if we ever needed to protect ourselves. After making sure we were okay, the officers reassured us and left. Once things settled down, we called Katie and let her know the strangers were gone. She came over, visibly shaken, and we all sat down to figure out who the men could have been. Katie insisted she didn't know anyone who would do something like that, and the situation became even stranger. The men not only claimed to be her friends, but also said they knew her boyfriend. Yet her boyfriend didn't even live in the same state where we were going to school. Natalie hadn't recognized the men either, even though she had met most of Katie's friends. By then it was close to 5 a.m., so I didn't bother trying to sleep since I had a workshop that morning. When I shared the story with my classmates, they were just as freaked out as we were. For the rest of the day, Natalie and I were on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound, every flicker of movement, every passing shadow. That night it was hard to sleep. I kept expecting to hear knocking at the door again. Thankfully, they never came back, but that almost makes the whole experience even more unsettling. What did they want that night? Did they think we were hiding Katie? Was Katie unknowingly involved with people who weren't who they seemed to be? We'll probably never know. I guess I'll never truly know what could have happened that night. I try not to let it consume me, but sometimes I wonder, was my life in danger? The fact that those men weren't wearing face coverings still unsettles me. It suggests they might not have cared about leaving witnesses if they had committed a crime. Despite the uncertainty, I remain firm in my decision. I'll never open the door to random strangers insisting on being let in. My unease hasn't lessened over time, especially since my husband works a rotating schedule. Sometimes he's gone during the night, leaving me and our daughter alone. Even though we live in the countryside, supposedly safer, I can't help but feel vulnerable when he's not home. 2 nights ago, on the first day of his night shift rotation, something chilling happened. It was around 9:30 p.m. I was doing dishes while my daughter watched TV in the living room. Suddenly, I heard the distinct swoosh of our screen door opening. A moment later, I saw the handle of the main door turn all the way down. Thankfully, our main door has an electronic keypad lock, so even though the handle turned, the door remained secured. Relief washed over me. Just earlier, I had made sure to lock it. But as the door handle moved, our dogs erupted into a frenzy. They barked, growled, and ran to the windows, trying to peer outside. I forced myself to look out the window, dreading what I might see. To my surprise, there was nothing. No person, no car, just darkness. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I grabbed my daughter, took her to the bedroom, and immediately called 911. The police arrived quickly, likely already patrolling the area. After explaining what had happened, they conducted a brief search. Their conclusion? The wind had probably pushed the screen door open. They assured me no one was out there, but I wasn't convinced. Living in the woods, someone could have easily been watching us from a safe distance, blending into the shadows. Their half-hearted search left me feeling uneasy. Since then, I've been locking the screen door too, despite never feeling the need to before. What unnerves me the most is that our house didn't appear empty. All the lights were on, and the TV was playing a program. Whoever turned that door handle must have known someone was home, yet they tried anyway. The deep, primal fear I felt when the door handle moved is indescribable. I'm grateful for our dogs. Their loud barking likely scared the person off. I can't shake the thought of what might have happened otherwise. This incident reminded me of another unsettling experience from 2016. Back then, I was 17, a first-year college student in film school, and living alone for the first time. My tiny apartment, though modest, filled me with pride. I loved my newfound independence. The apartment complex had multiple security gates that required codes only residents knew. My door had 3 separate locks, and the area was near my university, filled with other students. It felt safe, and I never worried about my safety. I was also meticulous about locking my door whenever I left. My slight OCD made me double-check it every time. But one day, as I locked the door before heading to class, the key jammed. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pull it out. In a panic, I went to find the building's caretaker, but he wasn't available. Already running late for class, I made the difficult decision to leave the key in the lock. I removed it from my keychain, hoping it wouldn't be too noticeable. When I returned home, the caretaker helped me retrieve the key, though it took nearly 15 minutes of effort. He informed me that the lock was damaged, but reassured me that replacing it wasn't urgent. If I only locked the door once from the inside instead of twice, it would still work, or so the caretaker reassured me. I agreed and didn't think much more about it. The building felt safe, and I didn't feel the need to worry. Fast forward 2 months. It was 11 p.m., and I was taking out the trash while chatting on the phone with my sister. I casually mentioned my plans to take a shower before heading to a party. As always, I locked the door behind me, even for a quick trip outside, since I could only secure it once due to the damaged lock. When I returned to my apartment, I immediately noticed something was off. The door was unlocked. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as a possible oversight. I stepped into my 215 square foot apartment, the layout simple. The main room directly ahead, with the bathroom door slightly ajar to my left. My heart stopped when I caught sight of a man in the shower, his back turned to me. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the door, desperate to escape, but the damaged lock betrayed me. It jammed. No matter how hard I twisted and pulled, it wouldn't budge. In that moment of sheer terror, I didn't think, I acted. I flung open my window and jumped, despite living on the second floor. The fall was brutal. I shattered my ankles upon landing, pain radiating through my legs. Ignoring the agony, I scrambled away from the building as quickly as my injuries allowed. Glancing back, I saw him standing at the window watching me. My mind raced. Either he'd jump and chase me, or he'd stay put, too afraid of heights. Thankfully, he chose the latter. I found a bush nearby to hide in and called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes, the station being close by. The officers forced my apartment door open and found the man sitting on my couch, clutching a kitchen knife, as if waiting for me to return. They arrested him on the spot. Later, the police revealed his chilling history: multiple charges of sexual assault, rape, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. The investigation uncovered how he'd gained access to the building. Other residents, assuming he was just another student, had held the door open for him. While lurking in the hallway, he overheard my conversation with my sister about taking a shower and decided to wait for me in the bathroom. He had picked my lock while I was taking out the trash. It turned out this wasn't his first attempt. He'd been following me home from campus several times before finally succeeding in breaking in. The only reason he stayed inside was because he saw my old phone sitting on a table, leading him to believe I didn't have a phone with me to call for help. I no longer lived there, and after the incident, the building implemented stricter security measures. But the memory of that night still haunts me, a stark reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. To enter the building now, residents need to show identification proving residency. Building IDs were introduced, and we must scan them for access every time. Since these changes were implemented, nothing bad has happened in the building again. My name is Thomas, a 33-year-old man living in Baltimore City, commonly referred to as B-More. Baltimore has its challenges, but when you've spent your entire life here, you learn to adapt. This story takes place 5 years ago when I was 28. I was walking to a friend's place around 10 p.m. to buy some marijuana. His house was about a 15-minute walk from mine, and on my way back, I decided to stop at a store. I had my cousin's Independence card and figured I'd grab some snacks for a post-smoke munch session. As I walked home, I noticed a white car drive past me, then pull over onto a side street a block ahead. I had my earphones in but wasn't playing anything, just in case I needed to stay alert. Approaching the block where the car had stopped, I saw a man get out and start following me. His pace quickened, and as he closed the distance between us, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. When he got close enough, he muttered something. Irritated, I pulled out one earbud and asked, "What do you want?" His response was immediate and menacing. "Don't talk to me like that." That's when I noticed the silver firearm in his coat. In my hands, I was holding a bag of junk food. Hidden in my shoe was a small bag of marijuana. Without hesitation, he barked, "Where's the money at?" In that instant, I realized I was being robbed. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay as calm as possible. I stopped walking and looked at him. "I don't have any money, just this bag of green," I stammered. That's when another man got out of the car, also armed, and positioned himself to my right. Standing between two armed men, I made the only move I could think of. I took off my shoe and threw the bag of green on the ground. "That's all I've got," I stuttered. One of them barked angrily, "Put your shoe back on." As I bent down to comply, I noticed several people nearby watching the scene unfold, their faces a mix of shock and fear. The man on my left then growled, "Yo, if you don't pull out $1, I'm gonna shoot you." With no money and no other way to defuse the situation, my instincts kicked in. My fight or flight response chose flight. Hoisting my pants up, I prepared myself. Before I could say another word, I sprinted up the street as fast as I could. My house was only 3 minutes away. I passed by stunned bystanders who had clearly witnessed the ordeal. 2 blocks from my house, I veered into a parking lot and ducked behind a gate surrounded by thick bushes and trees. There, I stopped to catch my breath, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. I didn't stay long, fearful they might still be chasing me. I got up and jogged the rest of the way home. Once safely inside, I locked the doors and took a moment to compose myself. After making sure I wasn't followed, I sat down with my 8-year-old cousin. Ironically, earlier that day, I had been warning him about the dangers of being out in Baltimore after dark. That incident was a wake-up call. I've avoided going out after dark ever since. Instead of focusing on her breakup, my mom revealed something more urgent. Our doorknob was busted and unlocked, and there were clear scrape marks on our bolt lock. Outside, half a dozen police officers stood near our neighbor's house. She explained that our neighbors had been broken into, and that the intruders had tried to get into our house too. Thankfully, our extra security measures, like the bolt lock and chain, had stopped them. Mom then took us to check on the neighbors, whose kids we often played with. Luckily, their children were staying at their grandma's house for a sleepover that night. As we walked through their home, it became clear how much they had lost. Everything was gone, even the food in their cabinets. But something fell off. Everyone avoided the living room. Police officers were busy interviewing their mom there, and we soon learned why. The wall in their living room, which connected to our bedroom, had a massive indentation, about 6 feet in diameter and a foot deep. The burglars had spent hours trying to chisel their way into our house through the shared wall. It turned out the robbers had successfully broken into 3 other homes in the neighborhood that night by forcing the front doors. But our house was different. Our unit had been added to the building later, and the shared wall was actually a solid brick exterior wall, unlike the thinner walls in the other units. The robbers must have realized they couldn't get through and eventually gave up, leaving behind the damage. From that day on, Mom never told us again that strange noises were just the wind. Story 10. I used to work the night shift at a homeless shelter, and over the years, I saw my fair share of strange events. But nothing was as bizarre as the night I thought I was witnessing the beginning of a zombie apocalypse. Ned, A 35-year-old alcoholic staying at the shelter got up around midnight to have a smoke. I let him out into the courtyard and went back inside to do some chores. About 10 minutes later, I noticed Ned was gone. This wasn't unusual given his habits, so I returned to my desk to focus on paperwork. Soon after, I heard rustling outside. When I looked up, I saw Ned at the window, his face covered in blood. Alarmed, I opened the door to ask what had happened. Ned growled at me and lunged forward, arms outstretched. Panicking, I slammed the door shut and stepped back. Ned fumbled with the doorknob, growling and snarling. Another shelter resident came by, saw what was happening, and quickly retreated. Then Ned stopped trying to get in and began running around the yard, still growling. At one point, he started climbing the fence. Completely at a loss, I called 911. The dispatcher was baffled by my description, but sent the police anyway. When the officers arrived, Ned ran at them, snarling like an animal, and hurled himself over the fence. One officer pulled his gun, while the other ready to taser. From my position at the window, where Ned's blood, spit, and mucus smeared the glass, I watched as the officers shouted at him. Suddenly, Ned stopped. He calmly walked to the door, picked up a cigarette, but lit it and took a puff. The cops cautiously approached, their weapons still drawn. Ned smiled and said, "Didn't do it, man." It turned out Ned had a seizure disorder. Unlike typical seizures where people fall and shake, his episodes caused him to act aggressively and erratically. But to me, in those chaotic moments, it felt like he had gone full-on zombie.